all the right-wing education and prejudices of my upbringing. And little by little, by the mid-1970s, I had become somebody who believed in socialism, who believed in Marxism-Leninism. And then all of a sudden, the greatest achievement of the working class ever gets blown away. So how do you explain it? Now we expected, Roger and I, that there would be a rush of writing on this after 1991, only there wasn't. And I was walking around half dazed because my whole world was turned upside down. My political commitments to the anti-war movement, to the union movement, to anti-racism movements, to political movements, were all based on a view of the world that now, everyone was telling me, was no longer valid. But nobody was writing about it. So he and I, back in 1999, it took me a number of years to persuade my friend, and he's a real historian, not like me, to work at this. And over the next 4 years, we put together an analysis. Now let me tell you a little bit about our analysis, because it's a great paradox. When Gorbachev came into power in 1985, there was no crisis in the USSR. There were problems, to be sure, but these were chronic, not acute. None of the earmarks of a system in crisis existed. The economy was not floundering. Economic growth was occurring at a lower than in the 1950s, but higher than in the US. And little by little, the Soviet Union was closing the gap with the US standard of living. Standards of living in the Soviet Union were approximating those of Western Europe and getting closer to those in the USA. There were no signs of mass political discontent. No strikes, no demonstrations, no petitions, no protests. Polls show that the people in the Soviet Union had about the same amount of support for the existing social arrangements as people in the United States. So how do you explain this paradox? So we read, and we read, and we read. And most of the books in our first 2 years of reading were by the usual standard anti-communist thinkers who had an analysis that essentially celebrated the demise of the Soviet Union, and whose core theme, like all anti-communism, is that the Soviet Union collapsed because of over-centralization and bureaucratization, and it never could have really survived. So we had two epiphanies. We had to explain if you're historical materials, and we were and are, you have to explain, where does this consciousness, this capitalist consciousness, come from? It wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It was supposed to be a society evolving into classlessness. Two things. One, we discovered in the literature a vast amount of material, which I had not been familiar with, on the so-called second economy. And in the 30 years prior to 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, this second economy had grown and grown and grown. And it was the fact that it had been tolerated by the leadership was an example of the revisionism that some of the previous speakers have been referring to. It was a source of corruption within Soviet society that was under the surface, but which was getting bigger and bigger. And in our book, we discussed the estimation of how big it was. In some of the component nations of the Soviet Union, it was as high as 40%, even 50%. Especially, ironically, in the Caucasus area where Gorbachev and Shevardnadze came from. The second thing we learned is that, and it was another epiphany, there were two trends of thought in this political thought in the Soviet Union. And this is not, if you read all the books from Progress publishers, they'll never go into this. But it happened by accident. We read the memoirs of Molotov, who was one of the chief lieutenants of Stalin. And then we read the memoirs of a guy named Anatoly Chernyayev, who was one of the chief assistants and thinkers and brain trusters of Gorbachev. And they took positions on, let's say, 20 different questions. They had absolutely opposite positions on everything. Decentralization, centralization, internationalism versus nationalism, you name it, they had opposite positions. It dawned on us that there were two fundamental trends in Soviet political thought. One of them was the right-wing trend of Bukharin and Khrushchev and Chernyayev and Gorbachev, which basically was a social democratic vision, a loose vision of building socialism. And the other trend was that of Lenin and Stalin and Andropov, who was only ran the country briefly in 1983, but who was very much in the Lenin tradition. So we put those two thoughts together, and we came up with our analysis. So that's a preview of what this book contains. It came out in 2004. It had a second edition in 2010. It's been translated into 11 languages. I'm proud of that fact. We didn't know we were going to do so well. I think it has become the standard explanation within the international communist movement of the causes of the Soviet collapse. I just want to conclude with one, and then another standard explanation, I would say, is the analysis put out by the Greek Communist Party, which is available at their website. It's called Theses on Socialism. And there's a lot of common ground between our analysis and theirs. So let me get to the end of my point, which is, even though our numbers are relatively sparse today, although we didn't do too badly, I think you ought to hear that the work you do is extremely important. Nothing is more important in 20th century history than the Soviet Union. There are historians, very eminent ones, who say that the Soviet Union's existence defined the 20th century. And they say the 20th century is a short century. It ran from 1917 to 1991, because that period of continuity was the period of the existence of the Soviet Union, and everything important, the anti-colonial movement, the anti-fascist movement, the two world wars, all of them were connected to the revolution that took place 98 years ago. I also think it's important not just to have a handle on the 20th century, but to have an understanding of the 21st century and what we are going to face. We will not get masses of people to fight for socialism in this century unless they have some sense that the experiments of the past made sense. They were not just gross errors and in periods of insanity lasting for decades. These were not societies, these socialist societies run by madmen and butchers. These were the most vital democratic socialist experiments ever. And therefore, the work that the US Friends does is important, because what we above all need is we need, I guess, solidarity with the people in the Soviet Union, the ones who are still struggling to bring back socialism, but we also need, for this country, education. The level of ignorance about the reality of the Soviet Union is so enormous that an organization devoted to educating people about how wonderful a society it was is absolutely important. So with that, thank you very much. By the mid-1970s, I had become somebody who believed in socialism, who believed in Marxism-Leninism,